Oh, of course, I have failure right away. That's awesome. Oh, you're killing me. Wow. I was so ready for this, right? All right. What is up, ng-conf attendees? Shout out to all of our ng-conf extended viewers out there. We're glad to have you, right? Man, I can't believe I'm sitting in this ng content slot right between Papa and Star Wars and Walling and TypeScript. I mean, that's like being surrounded by 4 points of awesomeness, right? And it's pretty dope. All right. I'm Justin Schwartzenberger, and I'm stoked to be telling you about Angular 2's fresh approach to style. But before I begin, I want to start off with an acknowledgement. You see, we're all out there working hard, writing a bunch of front-end code for client applications. And along that journey, we start getting told that we're not designers. And maybe we hear it at our company or from others in the industry, or we read about it online. And then it's weird, we start chanting it ourselves, right? But I'm not a designer. And okay, sure, maybe as front-end developers, we're not out there building mock-ups or creating graphics, coming up with a color scheme or a font strategy. But we are implementing those. Front-end developers are design implementers. We are. You are. We need to embrace that. I mean, we have been since day one, right? We got into this web dev game by learning the trifecta of skills: JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. Implementers of design. It's what we do. I mean, we bring a ton of style, right? In fact, front-end developers are on point bringing style to the web app space. Hey, you know who else is bringing style to the web app space? That one. Angular. Heck yeah, it is. Let's talk a little bit about how it's doing that. So we're all familiar, especially from the last presentation, about how we get CSS into our components, right? We can make use of this styles or the style URL's component metadata property. And we're probably familiar with what Angular is doing with that CSS that we write. It's sticking it in this style tag and then sticking that up in the head tag of our DOM. And you might have even noticed that Angular is shimming that CSS that we write, attaching this unique attribute name. But why the heck is it doing this, and what's the purpose? Let's start with the why. So components in Angular actually have a view encapsulation mode. Now there's 3 of these modes available: native, none, and emulated. So let's hop into some code and we'll see these things in action. So in our components, we can make use of this component metadata property named Encapsulation here to set our view encapsulation mode on our components. Now I'm using TypeScript here, and Angular exports this TypeScript enum named view encapsulation that we can use to set this encapsulation value. So native, is designed to render our components using the shadow DOM in browsers that support it, like Chrome over here, basically implementing web components. So Angular is going to take our component template, it's going to put it inside of this shadow root, and it's going to take the CSS that we wrote, put it in a style tag, but it's going to put that style tag inside this shadow root. And it's going to output our CSS the same way we wrote it, because it's encapsulated within this shadow boundary. So that's native mode. Now none is designed to, well, do no view encapsulation. So we've got no shadow DOM, okay? Now Angular is taking the CSS that we write, and it's putting it into a style tag, and it's putting that up in the head tag of the DOM. But just like native mode, it's outputting that CSS in the same way that we wrote it, okay? Because we told it no encapsulation. And then there's emulated. Now, emulated is the default view encapsulation mode for components in Angular out of the box. So we can get to the why. In emulated mode, Angular is doing this stuff with our CSS to encapsulate it within our component and its view contents. So just like the shadow DOM and the web component concept. So Angular is going to take this CSS that we wrote, it's going to stick it inside of a style tag, and stick that up in the head tag of the DOM. But Angular is going to shim that CSS that we wrote, attaching these unique attribute names. Okay? And it's going to take this unique attribute name and add it to all of our DOM elements that are coming from this component template. Okay? So it's creating this scoping of our CSS to our component. Now what this means is that we're not going to get any bleed of our CSS outside of this component. So if we come over here and we add another child component to here, so I'm already importing this real mug component and it's already added to the directives, so I can go ahead and use it in the template. So I have this figure element here, and I'm going to put this real mug inside of there. Now this real mug component, in its template, is making use of a CSS class named mug here on one of its elements. Okay? And my user card component actually has a class with that same name. So if we inspect the CSS for these things, check these things out, we're going to see that both of them have this mug class, right? And this user card component has a bunch of border styles and a min width. And the real mug class just has a border radius to give it some rounded corners. So we check this thing out in the browser. We can see that we get no bleed, okay? This image here from our user card component is getting all that border style and the other one's not. And if we inspect this thing, we can see that this element is getting shimmed with this _ng-content attribute, _ng-content -kyf-2. And we've got a different shim on here on our real mug, and this one's ng-content -kfy-3. So they've got their own unique ones. And if we look at the style here, we can see that the CSS for both of our components is getting set up with those two unique attribute names, right? So here's our style for our user card component. Its mug is getting ng-content 2, and here's the style for our real mug component, and it's getting its mug class with ng-content -3. And so that's giving us this pairing and this scoping. So now Angular is creating these unique attribute names for us when it processes our components, and it's dynamically generating those 3 characters there in between that number. So what this means is if we were to refresh the browser here, okay, and check this thing out, we're going to see that we're going to get a new unique attribute. This time we're looking at -uim-3. So what this means is don't go using this in any CSS styles that you write, because that's not for this, okay? So Angular is doing this, using this attribute selector for us to do this scoping thing, which is pretty cool, right? So with web components, the shadow DOM is used to encapsulate our style, keeping unwanted styles out and containing its styles within. With Angular's embedded mode CSS shim, we get that same encapsulation. And in both cases, we get it without even having to think about it when we write it. And I mean, really, let's be real. I mean, this is totally liberating, right? Because as implementers of design, we've all been down that road of having to deal with styles bleeding down the DOM tree and having to come up with different naming conventions and syntaxes to try and solve that encapsulation, right? I mean, we can even build a new component, and if we want to show something as selected, use a class name as generic as selected. And we could use that same class name on all of our elements in our application, and they'll all be their own unique version of selected. So we have this complete freedom for CSS name reuse. I can even get crazy. Come over here and go into this user card component CSS. And you know what? I'm going to add this image selector here and give this thing some styling. And man, I know this probably seems like a really bad idea, right? I mean, image selector, it's a pretty common DOM element. This thing's not that specific. I mean, your senses are going like, this is going to be a bad idea, right? So you know what? I'm not even going to be worried about it. Why? Well, if we hop over to the browser here and inspect this thing and check out the style, we can see that Angular is shimming that image selector that we wrote, right? Adding this unique attribute name. And as we know, this unique attribute name is only getting put on the elements that are coming from the specific component. So we got our encapsulation, right? So no other image elements outside of this component or anywhere down the component tree were harmed in the making of this style. And look, yeah, it's awesome, right? I mean, we've been trying to solve this scoping thing in the web space for a while now, right? Angular just slid in here and styled it out for us. I mean, why is this not getting more fanfare? We got to spread the word. All right, so take a sip of water. Web components have these shadow DOM pseudo-class selectors that let us work with the host element, right? So we got things like :host and :host-context. No worries, because Angular's got us covered on those too. Let's start talking about what :host is used for. So when we create our components, we provide a selector, right? That's telling Angular, hey, be on the lookout for a custom element inside the DOM. If you find that matching selector, inject our component template inside of it. So when we want to style that custom element, the host element, we can write a selector of :host. So over here in this user card component, I'm going to add this selector of :host. Okay, I'm going to give this thing a border. And some padding. Now there's one other style that we need to give this thing. Because we're targeting a custom element, browsers don't have any default styling out of the box for those. So we want to give this thing a display box context. So I'm going to give it a display of block as well. Okay. Now if we hop over to the browser and check this thing out, obviously we see our style applied. And when we look at this user card, we see that Angular is adding another one of these custom attributes. This one named _ng-host, dash some random characters, dash a number. And it's putting that onto our user card, right? And up in our style, we can see that Angular has shimmed this CSS for us, changing that :host selector to be this _ng-host attribute. Okay? Because :host doesn't work outside of shadow DOM mode. Now, just like _ng-content, Angular is creating these things for us dynamically when it processes our components. So don't go styling using this one either, right? Okay. And if we look down here to our DOM, we can see that Angular is adding this ng-host only to our custom elements that we're telling that we want to use for our components, right? So user card here's got one. And if we go into this figure element and we check this thing out, we can see that real mug has one as well. So it's only putting it on that custom element, which makes sense because they are the host of our components after all, right? So Angular is doing this CSS shim for us when we're running in embedded mode. And again, that's the default view encapsulation mode for Angular components out of the box. And this gets to be pretty cool too, because now we can hop over to our component and we can put this user card component into native mode. And we can switch back over to the browser and inspect this thing and see that the shadow DOM is being used, right? So our style is getting output as is, and we've got this :host selector in here being output as we wrote it, because that selector works when we're in shadow DOM. So we write this CSS as if we're writing it for web components, and Angular knows what to do with it when we're rolling in embedded mode or not. Okay. But wait a minute. I just felt a disturbance in the force, as if millions of voices just cried out, CSS bleed. And okay, I know, you're sitting there thinking, come on, Justin, we knew that image selector was like playing with the dark side, right? I mean, we got this opacity bleeding all over the place, right? But hold on, let's pump the brakes. It's not actually bleed, okay? Because our parent component, our user card component, is in native mode, it's using the shadow DOM, right? So our image selector is being output as is, with no shim. So it's going to pick up all image elements within this shadow boundary. Now our child component, real mug, is not in native mode. So it's rendering out its markup within this shadow boundary. So all of its image elements are fair game for that selector. Now we can solve this if we hop over to our real mud component and we put this puppy into native mode as well. All right. Back over the browser. And we see that fix is applied, right? And if we inspect this thing, we've got our shadow DOM being used. And so that shadow root and that shadow boundary is keeping out that other style, right? So now we've got that fixed. But, I mean, if we go this route, then you know it's most likely that we're shadow DOMing all the way down the tree. So while shadow DOM is cool, we could say that Angular's emulation is cooler. Maybe? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Depends on what you're trying to pull off with your CSS, right? It's still pretty cool, though. All right, let's talk about another one of these shadow DOM selectors. :host-context is designed to say, hey, if the provided selector is either on the host element or anywhere up the DOM tree from the host element, go ahead and apply these styles to the host. So we can come over here, and in this user card component, I've got this figure element, right? And it has a CSS class of card on it. And our real mud component is nested inside of that. So let's use that class card to style against that. So down in the CSS for our real mud component, I'm going to add this :host-context selector. And I'm going to tell it, hey, be on the lookout for this class card. Now, just like :host, we're targeting a custom element here. So we need to give this thing a display box context. So display a block. Okay. And then I'm going to give it a background color. And some padding. And a width. If we hop back over the browser, we can see our styles applied visually, right? And with both of these components still in native mode, we can inspect this thing, and we can see that our style of that :host context is being output as is, because that works for our native shadow DOM mode, right? Now let's add another one of these. And this time I'm going to add it outside of that tree where that class card is in. So I'm going to go into this app component. And in this app component, I've already imported our real mud component and added it to the directives, so I can use it inside of this template. So I'm going to add real mud. And we can see that the second one is not going to get the style applied because it's not matching that selector of host context and those rules. So let's add one more here. And this time I'm going to add it, and I'm going to put the CSS class on this thing. Because again, host context is designed to work if that matching selector is found on the host element as well. So class card. We let this thing reload. We can see that that third one is getting the style, right? Okay, so that's how :host context is designed to be used and how it works in the shadow DOM native mode. So naturally, we're going to ask Angular, where are you at? And if we hop over to our code and we set both of this real mud component and this user card component into emulated mode, hop back over the browser, let this thing load. Angular's like, please, I got this. And if we inspect this thing and check out its style, we can see that Angular is shimming this thing the same way it did :host, replacing that host context that we wrote with this _ng-host attribute and combining it with our card class here. Now, you notice there's a comma in there. So Angular's writing out 2 selectors for us? Yep, 2. Because remember, :host-context is designed to work when the provided selector is either on the host element, so selector 1 here, _ng-host dot the class, and it's there to work when that provided selector is anywhere up the DOM tree from our host element. So selector 2, the class, space our ng-host attribute, right? So good old Angular's got us covered. And again, we wrote this CSS in one way, and Angular handled the details for us. Now, as we know, not all browser vendors support this shadow DOM and this web component thing yet, right? But it's all good, because we're using Angular. And Angular lets us write this CSS for the future, and through emulation mode, have it work in the present. So Jamie, where are you at? You are a design implementer. Leah, Greg, I know you're tuning in. Design implementers. Fellow front-end developers, we are design implementers. And Angular's here to help us implement that design more logically. Thanks a ton for letting me share this stuff with you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.